Hi everyone. See a few people joining now. We'll just give it a few minutes for everyone to join. But obviously, thank you all for coming. Um, just while we are waiting for others to join, please do jot down in the chat, as it says on the slide, if you want to introduce yourself, your role, the organisation that you're from. If you're happy to add your organisation to your display name as well, it'd be quite helpful. You can change that, and also just keep yourself mute too while others are talking. Great. Just give it another couple of minutes, see a few more people joining the room. If you click on the three dots at the top right of your video, you should have the rename option. So you can add your organization to your name there. Great. I think the traffic is slowing down in the waiting room, so I think we'll make a start. Again, thank you so much for joining. If you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat. Add your name to your Zoom, add your organization to your Zoom name. Um, Quick bit of housekeeping before we dive in. Please do make use of the chat box. Make sure that you're messaging everyone when you send your questions in the chat box. Please do keep your microphone on while others are speaking. We will have breakout rooms. There'll be two breakout rooms, so you will have an opportunity to speak. The event is being recorded, so please do turn off your camera if you only wish to have your, or if you don't wish to have your video on the recording. And we'll be sending out a bunch of helpful links in the follow-up email with further resources after the event. I think we can move on to the next slide. Well, great. Once again, thank you so much for attending. I'm John, senior consultant at NPC. Hopefully you can hear me clearly. Had a last minute power cut from my entire apartment building, so I'm joining from a cafe. So hopefully the Wi-Fi will hold up through the events. But one of my trusty NPC colleagues will jump in if I do go down. But I was the project lead for this bit of research, and I'll be your main host for today. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to have a quick introduction from my colleague Alex and Suzanne from the Lloyds Bank Foundation, talking a bit about the context behind this research, the wider funding landscape. Then I'm going to talk through the scope of the research and hand over to my colleague Khan for the methodology. Then Khan will present the research findings, kind of mapping funding flows into the criminal justice voluntary sector. Then he'll hand back to me to talk about our research findings on voluntary organisations navigating this funding landscape. Then we'll go into our first breakout discussion, which will be your reactions to our findings. We have a series of prompts to kind of facilitate the discussion there. Then back to me to go through our recommendations that resulted from the research about how to better understand help voluntary organisations working with and around the CJS, the criminal justice system. Then a second breakout discussion on reflections on the recommendations, what stood out to you, what was missed, the key recommendations, etc. Then wrap up and next steps. As I said, a follow-up email with a bunch of helpful links. So that's the agenda for today. Great. So before we dive into our research recommendations, I'm going to introduce my colleague Alex, who's the Director for Transforming Funding at NPC, to give an overview of recent trends in the funding landscape at large. Over to you, Alex.
Great. Thanks, John. It's great to be here today. and thank you to everyone for coming along. I feel slightly fraudulent in that I was not involved in this piece of work, so I'm not going to take any credit for it. It's a really brilliant piece of work, and I would recommend, after this, everyone have a read of this. For those who don't know us, MPC is a think tank and consultancy with a purpose. We play a crucial role at the heart of the impact sector, and we work to strengthen and support the sector. We do that through a range of ways. We convene, we influence, we have consultancy, collaborative projects, and we share our learning as we go. So a lot of those things are actually already in play here at the moment. And as John said, I have the kind of slightly grandiose job title of transforming funding, which means that I lead a lot of the work that we do with funders and philanthropists and impact investors. I don't want to start on a downer, but I think we all probably know how challenging the funding sector is at the moment. A lot of people talk to me about how they haven't seen challenges like this before, that we know that there are a range of challenges. And actually, that's why I think projects like this are so important, because I think it gives us real understanding, real data. One of the things about NPC is we really care about data, and this really shows us actually what's happening and therefore how we can react to that as an organization. Um, so, some of the things we have seen over the past 12, 18 months, we have seen a lot of funders close their doors. That has happened for a number of different reasons. Some of them are spending their money down, some of them are repurposing, re-strategizing, some of them are kind of changing their focus. I'm not sure we know exactly what the knock-on effects of that will be, but we are seeing a number of organizations who unfortunately are closing their doors at the moment. And if you keep an eye on those, what the most common trend in that is that it's a challenging funding landscape. So I think we all know that. That's kind of from the trust and foundation point of view. I think we also are going to see ongoing challenges for some of the other funding avenues. Central government, I mean, we know that the current government is interested in criminal justice. We saw some kind of interest in there, but they are fiscally constrained, I think is the nicest way of saying where they are at the moment. So actually, what that means for the sector in terms of ongoing funding, I think is going to remain challenging. We also know the challenges of local government. And actually, we did a piece of research last year called State of the Sector. And actually, some of the things it showed was that contracts from local government were not keeping in line with inflation, that contracts from government were actually not, or local government were not covering the full cost of service. And actually, then people are turned to trusts and foundations, and we get the knock-on effect of some of those sorts of things. But as I said, I don't really want to start on an incredibly negative point of view from the very beginning. So what I do think you'll see in the results of this actually is some of these things playing out. Actually, the uneven splits, the challenges around statutory funding, some of those sorts of things, without giving away too much of the results that you're going to see later. But I do think that that's why projects like this are really, really important. They give us the data, they give us the understanding so that we can go forward with that. And I think for funders especially, at least the funders really needing to think about how they work with the different organizations who play such vital roles within the system, who pick up such important work with vulnerable people. So how do they support them in the best way? And actually, how can they collaborate? How can they come together? How can they work as effectively together as possible to make sure that they can reach people as much as they can? So, yeah, thank you again for everyone for coming along and for the team for putting this together. And I'm going to hand over to Suzanne, I believe.
Thanks, Alex. And hello, everyone. Without kind of giving too much away of what's coming next from John and Khan, just a kind of overview, really, of criminal justice voluntary sector funding is, yeah, similarly stretched, but quite distinct picture of local and national government and statutory grants and contracts making up the vast bulk of funding in the sector. And as Alex said, it's very stretched currently and for the foreseeable. But that's also in addition to local, regional, national trusts and foundations. And some of those will be specialists in criminal justice funding. So they know a lot about charities working in the space and the people that they work with. But then there's more generalist funders who won't have that same kind of depth of knowledge, but doing the best. And I currently work at Lloyds Bank Foundation, not on the funding side. I'm a research associate, and we funded this project. But we are one example of that kind of more generalist funder And we've been funding small and medium-sized charities, working with people who have experience of the criminal justice system since 2016. More recently through our specialist programme, and charities that supporting offenders are just one of 8 themes that funding programme supports. And, you know, we're going through a strategy review currently. That might not be a focus for us in the future. And so, yeah, it's just speaking to that kind of fluctuation amongst funders, philanthropic and statutory, and kind of what that means for charities. Because each of those charities that we fund will be no doubt applying and reapplying for multiple pots of funding before, during, after their grant award with us. Simultaneously, charities, as many of you will well know, will be grappling with that kind of red tape and the logistics that come with having lived experience of the criminal justice system in your workforce. Working with people facing really complex issues and dealing with challenges of working in and around prisons and so on. So the roots of this project lie in wanting to do better by those charities and the people they serve, and wanting funding to work better for them. And the seed for those roots was planted during really top level conversations at the HMPPS Third Sector Partnership Board and the ACF CJS network, so the Association for Charitable Funders CJS network. And those conversations really centred around whether statutory funding was underpinning philanthropic funding or whether trusts and foundations were supplementing government funding. So a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario, and the answer isn't simple, and maybe it's a bit of both. But while those conversations are going on, it's charities and other voluntary sector organisations on the ground that are bearing the brunt of navigating that tricky landscape. So this is why we've, launched into this project. That's why and how it took shape. It's been supported throughout by Clinks, HMPPS and AB Charitable Trust. And we're very grateful for their input. And it's just a first step, really, to looking at who's funding who to do what, and to stimulate thinking about what happens next, and how we can adapt funder practice that will make things easier for voluntary sector organisations. So thank you so much for being here, and to NPC for bringing us all together. Really looking forward to getting into it and seeing where we get to.
Great. Thank you so much, Suzanne and Alec. We can move on to the next slides, please, Carl. Great. And one slide back, please. Perfect. So yeah, thanks, Suzanne and Alex, for the context behind this kind of research. Our research was guided from the beginning by these 4 overarching research aims. To improve awareness of the different funding flows into voluntary organisations working in and around the criminal justice system, or CJS. To increase knowledge of the different funding sources and processes and what works best for voluntary organisations, including, as Suzanne was just mentioning there, how statutory and philanthropic funding fits together in this space. To facilitate better understanding between the government and philanthropic funding sectors around how they might find joint solutions to support and strengthen voluntary organisations and the services they provide, which really ties into the last point around providing targeted recommendations that can be acted on by funders and commissioners to really improve the funding landscape for voluntary organisations and the communities and individuals that they serve. And those research aims kind of shaped the research questions on the slide. You can tell via a little magnifying glass icon we've got there. So the first one that Khan will be talking through is really this mapping question, like what are those main philanthropic government funding flows into the criminal justice voluntary sector? What are they funding? What kind of organisations? Which kind of activities or beneficiary groups do they support? Then I'm going to talk through our findings for the second question, which is how voluntary organisations navigate this space, the processes, the funding landscape, like the processes, procedures and timings of the various funding bodies and programmes. As mentioned, we'll present our findings against the first 2, then we'll go into the breakout discussions before I take us through the final question, which gets towards recommendations, is how can philanthropic and government funded practice be improved to better understand and help voluntary organisations working with and around the criminal justice sector. And I think having such an action-focused kind of aim behind the research really gets to like a key part of what Suzanne and Alex were talking about, like a real desire to see change and to improve this funding landscape for sure. Now I'm going to hand over Khan to talk through the specifics of our research methodology.
Perfect. Thank you, John. Can I just double check? Can everyone hear me all right? A nod would be great. Okay, perfect. So I'm Khan. I was the project analyst for this project, and I will, as John mentioned, I will talk to you about our methodology, and then I will share some of the insights for the first research question. So first and foremost, let's start with the sample, right? Let's answer how we devised our sample, what's included in it, and what are the resources behind that sample. So we have a sample of 624 charities. We use two sets of resources to understand charities operating in and around the criminal justice system. And there's a specific reason why we decided to go with that language, organizations in and around the criminal justice system, because we understand that there are organizations with different focus, and they may be a mental health charity, for example, providing services to young people, but as a part of their services, they may be providing like some counseling services to young people in prison, maybe like to 20 people or 30 people. So that can be an organization that we can classify as an organization around the criminal justice system with not the sole focus on criminal justice system in general. So that is a reasoning why we went with organizations in and around the criminal justice system. So coming to the resources and how we identify charities in our sample, we use two main resources. The first one is the Charity Classification Project, which is a joint project with NCDO, Sheffield Hallam University, and researcher David Kane. So they assign tags based on charities' activities, themes, and locations to each charity, and you can, for the charities in the room, you can check your tags by just searching Charity Classification Project. You should be able to see your tags attached. And the second one is the 360 Giving Grant NAV database. So we use the keyword search based on words related to criminal justice system, like offenders, prison, ex-offenders, criminal justice system. And we looked at the charities that received grants related to these themes in the last 5 years. So the first one, the Charity Classification Project, with the tags relevant to criminal justice system, we got 890 charities. And from the second source, from the 360 Giving Grant NAV database, we received 445 charities as results. Based on the charities, like the lists we received from these two sources, we obviously removed the duplicates. We removed the ones with £0 annual turnover in the last 2 financial years to understand the active charities within those lists. And also we removed the ones that are not operating in the UK. So they may be operating in Africa, but registered charity in the UK to fundraise in the UK. But if their operational area is not in the UK, we removed those charities. On the right-hand side, you see the data points we gathered for our charities in our sample. So from GrantNav, we got the grant, like funding amount, funder information, and from the Charity Commission, we got all the available data in their register, in their profile on Charity Commission. So having described the sample and how we came up with 624 charities in our sample to analyze, let me talk to you about the methodology. So we adopted a mixed methods approach to answer the research questions John mentioned. So we started with an external literature to analyze what's out there, the previous research, and then we collected quantitative data for our sample of 624 registered charities. We also interviewed relevant stakeholders involving charities, funders, and advocacy organizations to understand the landscape and the challenges they face. And we also conducted a survey answered by 55 voluntary organizations. Here, including, like, we included organizations that were not registered charities as a different approach to how we define the sample in the first slide I showed. And we finally conducted some case studies on organizations working with women and racially minoritized people. So alongside all these data collections, obviously we relied on previous NPC resources and some of the work that we've done over the last couple of years. So obviously every single methodology has its challenge and limitation. Here I want to mention a couple of challenges and limitations in our research very briefly. As I mentioned, our sample just includes charities, registered charities, because the Charity Commission database, the Charity Commission Register, provides the most comprehensive data set of the voluntary organizations working in and around the criminal justice system. So we decided to focus on the charities to have comparable data about them when we do the analysis. And the sample of 624 may include charities that have previously worked, have focused heavily on criminal justice system, but have little current work in the space. As you know, charities have self-identified themes, activities, beneficiaries on their Charity Commission profiles, and there are no directly relevant categorizations for criminal justice specific work, and we miss beneficiary groups like women, and this may lead to some inflation in numbers, especially for catch-all phrases. And finally, the assumption that we made when we analyzed the quantitative data, if a charity has multiple different beneficiary groups recorded on its Charity Commission profile, we assume that the annual income is equally divided among those listed beneficiary groups or themes. So we assume that the charity focuses on each beneficiary group equally, because there was no feasible way to reach to understand the individual and detailed focus of each charity in the sample of 624. So this slide is the overview of findings. I usually we presented the different version of this slides in previous events. So I usually wait here for a couple of seconds to allow you to look at the numbers and the information on the slide. But obviously you can find all of these findings in the report we published on our website, and also you have links to the report on our social media. And I will talk about some of these findings in the next couple of slides. So let's start with the size of charities, right? So when we look at the sample, nearly half of the charities in our sample are micro charities with annual incomes up to 100K. And as a standalone figure, it may not say much, but when we compare that figure with the wider sector, based on NCVO's research finding, the proportion of micro charities in our sample is smaller compared to the wider voluntary sector. And in the wider voluntary sector, according to NCVO research, 80% of all voluntary organizations have income up to 100K, while it's 80% for the voluntary organizations. In our sample, this is only 46%. When we look at the total income of the charities in our sample, it is 961.5 million in 2023. As a standalone figure, it may not say much, but when we look at the trends in the last 5 years, it means 16% increase. And considering the inflation in the last 5 years, these charities received less income in real terms in 2023 than 2019. This is despite the projected increase in prison population and crime statistics in the UK. The second slide, again, it's about size of charities, and there's a deeper dive on the funding types here. And let me explain this. The graph you see on the right-hand side. The graph on the right-hand side, on the x-axis on the bottom, you see macro, big, medium, small, and micro. They refer to charity sizes. So for micro, it's charities annual income up to 100K. For small, 100 to 500. For medium, it's 500,000 to 1 million, and it goes in an increasing scale. And for the colors, you see the trust and foundation percentage of funding for those specific group of charities, and purple. And for yellow, you see statutory percentage of all the funding received by charities grouped by their sizes. So the total amount of government funding to the charities in our sample through both grants and contracts was 550 million in 2023, which represents 57% of total income. Again, as a standalone, it may not say much, but when you compare it to the wider voluntary sector, it's a huge difference. The NCVA research says the government contribution to voluntary sector is 26% of total income. This is based on 2021-22 statistics, but there's a big difference between the amount of statutory funding in our sample versus the voluntary organizations in general, 57% to 26%. And most of the statutory funding goes to larger charities in our sample, with 94% of funding in 2023 going to macro charities with annual income above 2 million. So when we look at the beneficiary groups for the charities in our sample, we use as I mentioned previously, we use the Charity Commission Register to look at targeted beneficiary groups for each charity. We observed that general public, children, young people, other defined groups, older people, and people with disabilities are the most common groups in terms of number of charities. And there are some discrepancies between the number of charities focusing on specific beneficiary groups and their proportion of total income. For example, in the graph, you see children and young people, the second one, all from the left, while 21% of the charities in our sample focus on children and young people, they constitute 44% of the sample in terms of their annual income. So here, you can have the more detailed findings in the report, but I want to focus on two beneficiary groups. First is the racially minoritized groups. While over 27% of the prison population are from a minority ethnic group, just 7% of the charities in our sample identified people of particular ethnic or racial origin as the beneficiary group they focus on. So here I want to make a distinction between what we mean by charities having targeted focus on a specific beneficiary group. So obviously, since the part of the prison population is from a minority ethnic group, big charities may be working with minority ethnic groups as part of their wider service. But if they haven't listed people of a particular ethnic or racial origin as their target group on Charity Commission profile, they don't come up as a charity targeting this specific group of people. So here we are focusing on the charities that listed specific beneficiary groups on their profile as the targeted group. And second, older people, the proportion of prison population of age 50 plus increased from 10% to 21% between 2011 to 24. Just 12 of the charities in our sample and 4 of the overall income went to organizations selecting older people as a specific beneficiary group they work with. So here, another caveat and very an information that we want to provide. We haven't done a needs analysis. So we need a robust analysis of needs to understand and determine how much funding would be required to support different groups. And this was beyond of our research, but since we have some funders and policymakers in the group, we want to raise that we believe that doing a needs analysis is a promising opportunity for future research by pairing the discrepancies in funding allocation to different groups of people with needs analysis to bolster more targeted support for different groups going forward. And in terms of activities, as I mentioned, we used the charity classification tags And there were two tags that we focused on. The first one was offender support and rehabilitation. The second one is prevention and safety. And each charity has only one tag attached for the team. They can either be offender support or rehabilitation or prevention and safety. Obviously, they may provide services offering like both support, but we went with the most possible one for each charity, and they were already assigned by the charity classification project. So 71% of the sample charities are classified as offender support and rehabilitation, while only 29 classified as prevention and safety. And when we look at the sub-themes based on the Charity Commission profiles of the charities, education is the most common sub-theme, as you can see from the visual, the first one, consisting like 19% of the charities by number focusing on education and training, and they constitute almost 29% of the total income in this sample. So here again, I want to do a specific deep dive on two activities, disability and accommodation housing. For these two sub-themes, we observed that even though there are fewer charities focusing on these areas, as you can see from the graph, 4.4%, 4.2% of all charities in our sample, their shares of total income based on 2023 figures were higher than the proportion of the number of charities. And this is, I think, an interesting finding. And there may be several reasons for these trends, such as like housing services require larger financial commitments than other forms of service delivery, which may result in this specific activity being more suited to larger charities. And when we look at the income data, we have evidence supporting this hypothesis. 53% of the accommodation housing charities are medium to macro sized, compared to 34 in education and training and 38 in charities focusing on prevention of poverty. So this correlation between sub-themes and organization size may have very important implications for navigating the funding landscape based on their resources, based on resources available to them, and also given the challenges smaller organizations report facing. But that's a very good way to give the floor back to John, who's going to talk about how charities navigate the funding landscape by bringing different funding together.
Right. Thank you so much, Khan. So yes, as Khan was saying after the overview, I'll be talking through the experience of voluntary organisations like navigating this funding landscape, starting with how voluntary organisations bring different funding sources together. Now, as we move through these findings, I will point out where we see findings that align with our understanding of the wider voluntary sector at large. So organisations that aren't necessarily focused on criminal justice, but also the specific nuances related to the criminal justice system in particular and how that relates to this funding landscape. But yes, in terms of voluntary organisations' experience of bringing different funding sources together, how they kind of do this, understandably, lots of tailoring work to funder priorities, less so in terms of like changing service delivery we heard, but more about how or applicants kind of explain or describe their activities to funders, and especially organisations providing more kind of like multifaceted support. They're saying that this tends to be a little bit easier to try and help it meet the funder priorities that they're looking to meet. You know, support that ticks a lot of boxes, as one organisation put it, for those providing more multifaceted support. There's lots of applying across geographies, so mixing local and national funding sources, so local authorities, for example, as opposed to like big national funders like the lottery, but also specifically for those who are working in prisons, applying directly for commissions from prisons. We heard from quite a few organisations who didn't necessarily have a set geography for where they worked, but they kind of worked in whichever prisons they had an in, if that makes sense. So being kind of flexible in terms of their geography of where they work and kind of going where the funding is available rather than having a set geography from the outset, especially if they have a key relationship with someone, which ties into the next point there about how personal relationships are really important for organisations in this space, especially in relationships with individual funding commissioners, and especially for organisations who do get direct commissions, typically small commissions. Prison governors in particular were seen as like key individuals to have on side, and to build relationships with to be able to deliver in those prisons, which ties into the geography points earlier. There's a little bit about how organizations kind of navigate this landscape and bring these different funding sources together. Go to the next slide. Now, understandably, we're looking to lots of challenges were raised by trying to bring different funding sources together. We've tried to demonstrate these with some quotes on the screen. The main one, understandably, is different application and reporting requirements. Now, this can be quite time consuming for organizations to try and meet these different application and reporting requirements. And this was one thing that we found when we were looking for, or we were asking for like general comments from organizations like within the survey about the extent to which they agreed with different statements or for their comments, was that there really is a real kind of like diversity of funder practice within this space. It was, and as this quote says, like it was felt that some funders have like very disproportionate reporting and like application requirements for like small pots of funding in particular, but there are funders who are a bit more proportionate in their approach. But real diversity of approaches, which obviously can be time consuming for organisations looking to pull together different funding sources. Something that Suzanne mentioned, there's a distinction drawn in the qualitative data between CGS kind of focused funders or funders that had like a large body of work in the criminal justice space and organizations who are maybe more generalist or newer to the space. And it was felt that this was quite a difficult area to kind of navigate the criminal justice funding landscape, and that organizations felt that understandably those funders who had more of a track record had a greater understanding of the criminal justice funding landscape and how sometimes an understanding of what might work, or particularly like numbers around outputs or expectations around data and impact. Some of these, it was felt that understandably funders who had more of a track record had more understanding of the kind of nuances of work in this space. Then lastly, there was disagreement to the extent to which funders should be focusing on funding like innovation or innovative approaches versus some more kind of tried and tested methods. We saw quite a few comments in the qualitative comments about organizations saying that there should be more focus on supporting or like ongoing stability for programs that have that track record, but also understandably you got some perspective from the other sense saying that they welcome this focus or this perceived focus on funding innovation because it allowed newer organizations who maybe hadn't received funding or were trialing something new to try and get funding too. So there's disagreement over the extent to which this, like a perceived focus on behalf of funders on innovation, the extent to which that was appropriate. Then there were some positives, some positive comments about bringing funding sources together, understandably more challenges than positives, but some positives and opportunities, especially as I was mentioning with organizations tending to have more set delivery models and kind of describing them to different funders rather than like changing their delivery models. Being less reliant on one funding source for a project or for a set delivery model left organizations less vulnerable to some of the developments in the sector that Alex was talking about in the opening, where funders might change, or understandably like close for applications as they kind of pivot strategically, maybe away from the criminal justice sector or away from a certain kind of delivery model. So being less reliant on one funding source to these organizations, less vulnerable to those changes. As mentioned, lots of funder priorities to tailor applications to. And we heard lots of creative examples of how organizations kind of describe their work, especially that multifaceted support that ticks a lot of boxes, as I was saying. And given the range of funders, as mentioned, local, national, big, small, direct commissions from prisons, the real range of funders that organizations are applying to, there are lots of priorities out there to try and tailor applications to, which can help, obviously, in bringing together different funding sources. Understandably, for those of you, the findings on this slide won't be a big surprise in terms of what the voluntary organisations we spoke with or answered our survey, what they felt was more or less helpful types of funding. It's definitely aligned with our understanding of the wider voluntary sector beyond just the criminal justice system in terms of what voluntary organisations prefer. So less helpful types of funding, smaller pots of funding in particular, because as I said, the time taken to apply and application reporting processes felt to be quite disproportionate to the amount of funding kind of requested. Longer term funding understandably preferred because not needing to constantly reapply for funding and allowing organisations a bit of breathing room to kind of reflect and learn from their delivery as well, kind of like adapt as they go rather than always being on the lookout for more funding. Inflexible funding, both inflexible funding in terms of the kinds of costs that could be covered within like core costs or like staffing costs, sometimes not covered by stricter project or contract funding, but also the preference for flexible funding to provide that more kind of holistic, kind of tailored support. It was felt that contracts in particular could be focusing on like one particular type of activity or one particular need that was being met. So for organisations that were trying to provide a bit more holistic on a multifaceted support, flexible funding allows them to do that, as well as being able to meet core costs or costs often not covered by like stricter types of funding. As mentioned, these really did align with our understandings of the wider voluntary sector beyond the criminal justice landscape. We can move on to the next slide. And then understandably, when we're asking organisations what what helpful changes to the criminal justice funding landscape would look like, as you can see, longer term funding core costs and flexible funding at the top there, kind of dominating the most popular or the most impactful changes according to our survey respondents of those that they could select. We can move on to the next slide. Great. Now, as Khan mentioned, there are obviously discrepancies in terms of where we saw funding going, with the vast majority of statutory funding in particular going towards larger organisations. And we were careful when we were kind of conducting this research and presenting our findings at different events, like within the process, like presenting our initial findings in particular, not to foster a big versus small kind of organisations dynamic, which definitely came out in some of the feedback that we'd received in the previous presentation on initial findings. To say it was a consistent theme from the start of this research that this is a more difficult space for smaller organisations to navigate. And that was reflected, as it says on screen, from our survey responses. There was a strong agreement from both organisations that had funding, like a turnover under 500k, and organisations that were a bit larger and had funding over 500k, that the that statutory application processes in particular tended to favour larger organisations. In particular, it was highlighted that it's more difficult for organisations to meet small organisations to meet due diligence requirements, especially requiring like investments to potentially around like data protection or different processes or systems to be implemented to meet due diligence requirements. So it was more difficult for organisations, and maybe you had less resources or capacity to do that. But also just less time available, less limited resources, and fewer specialised roles in organisations. Typically, smaller organisations with staff wearing multiple different hats and having fewer full-time fundraisers, or a bit more in our wheelhouse, NPC, fewer kind of like specialized monitoring and evaluation kind of data people who can kind of measure the impact of their work and put this into application processes. So these limited resources and fewer specialized roles were felt to be a bit of a hindrance to smaller organizations in particular with application processes. And we believe that these findings might be behind another finding that we saw from the survey, which is pictured to the right, where we saw a greater degree, more organisations of the smaller organisations in our survey responses are those who had less than 500k of annual turnover. 45% of them being less confident about their financial sustainability over the next couple of years, compared to 21% for organisations above 500k. So yeah, a consistent theme that this was a more difficult landscape for smaller organisations in particular. Now, as mentioned from the beginning, one thing we were looking to understand is how kind of statutory and philanthropic funders kind of fit together and how organisations kind of experience statutory and philanthropic funders differently, if there were any differences between the two. And just an important caveat at the top that, as mentioned, there is a big diversity in practice between funders, so we don't want to hastily generalise and group statutory and philanthropic funders all together. Definitely not a monolith in each category, plenty of diversity in practice. This said, the comments from voluntary organisations who took part in the quantitative and qualitative kind of findings from our research showed that voluntary organisations tended to be more favourable towards philanthropic funders in particular. Obviously, this does have big implications for the criminal justice voluntary sector in particular, with so much funding in this space coming from statutory organisations compared to the wider voluntary sector at large, as Khan pointed out. In terms of specific challenges, one that Alex mentioned at the point, especially contracts not being fully recuperated, with organisations relying on more flexible funding to kind of plug the gaps if they're not recuperating the cost of contracts. Delays in receiving funding from philanthropic funders, so a delay between being awarded the funding and actually receiving the funding. Especially for smaller organisations, it was hard for them to kind of cover the gap by drawing down on reserves or bringing in more flexible sources in their interim. And we heard quite a few organisations talking about how they'd struggled with delays for statutory funding. But also something that actually emerged in our 2021 research, which we'll share a link to in the chat as well, was that it was quite difficult to secure funding for systems change initiatives. And there was a perception that perhaps understandably statutory funders were a little more hesitant to fund more kind of like systems focused initiatives, potentially a conflict of interest being lobbied, with paying to be lobbied. There's a perception that it could be viewed in this way. And as mentioned from our 2021 research, there does seem to be less or little focus in terms of funding towards more upstream, more systems focused initiatives, which is reflected in our findings from this research, where, as Khan mentioned, most funding going towards offender rehabilitation and support rather than prevention initiatives as well. Oh, those more upstream ones. So those are some of the differences that organisations, like the voluntary organisations, noted in their experience with statutory philanthropic funders. In terms of funder approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion, just a caveat to say that there was unified praise from voluntary organisations we spoke with about this perceived increased focus on equity in funder practice in recent years. There was a lot of praise for this perceived increased focus. And also, we don't want to be overly critical of funders here, because there's not like a one size fits all or like unified agreed approach. And understandably, some organisations we spoke to felt that different approaches benefited their organisation or their delivery model in particular. But some of the more general challenges that we noticed, or general criticisms of funder approaches to DEI, one of them was around not covering the costs associated of integrating an equity lens, not properly funding, say, like incorporating lived experience delivery models, building up trust with communities, but how this does take time to build relationships and often wasn't reflected in funding offers from funders. Also, some pushback against the accessibility of language, as the quote demonstrates, a bit of a backlash against pocketing or like kind of grouping together difference under like a catch-all term like BAME or BAME. As Khan mentioned, some catch-all terms within this space. So that was felt to be less helpful, and especially organisations wanting to see language that the communities that they're supporting felt reflected in. So those are some of the more general challenges that we saw, or criticisms of funder approaches to DEI in this space. But as mentioned, across the board, praise for this increased focus on equity in recent years. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk about some barriers to a better funding landscape, and especially barriers that were raised by the funder interviewees that we spoke with, and when we were going through our recommendations in particular. One of the key ones was like numerous, like a lot of uncertainty that's been created by government changes, numerous changes in focus and personnel. I think, if my memory serves me correctly, 7 different changes for the Minister of State for Prisons, Probation, and Reducing Reoffending in recent years. And with those changes, like changes in focus as well. Also from statutory funders, some uncertainty over like year-to-year budgets and how this makes it difficult for them to provide the organisations that they're supporting with security because of these changes in focus at the governmental level and changes in budgets in particular. Then, as mentioned, quite a lot of difference between prisoners, especially um, relationships with key individuals, prison governors in particular. Um, and this can make any kind of widespread change to the funded process or kind of collaboration potentially difficult to implement because there can be that variation prison to prison, especially depending on like relationships with individuals in key roles who do tend to commission a lot of work working directly in prison specifically. And also, lastly, just time and resource constraints on behalf of funders. Alex mentioned some of the challenges within this landscape at the beginning. And obviously, any kind of collaborative initiative, which our recommendations will get to, balancing these kind of like time for collaborative initiatives alongside like the ongoing obligations and day-to-day work of funders to support organisations who then go on to support the individuals and communities that they do. So these are some of the main barriers that are raised by funders in particular towards a better funding landscape. And lastly, before we go into our first breakout discussion, a quick summary of findings from our first two research questions. So mapping funding flows into the criminal justice voluntary sector. As mentioned, trusts and foundations tend to be the main source of income for small and medium-sized charities, while statutory funding does tend to go towards larger charities. As Khan went through, there are differences in funding going to organisations supporting specific beneficiary groups. Now, as caveated, robust analysis of need was outside of the scope of this research, but we did see disparities, say, for example, between the amount of funding going towards supporting young people compared to older people as a specific beneficiary group that organisations focus on supporting. And most funding going towards offender support and rehabilitation compared to prevention, with education and training in particular being the most popular sub-theme in terms of activities funded and supported. In terms of navigating the funding landscape, again, lots of similarities with the wider voluntary sector, both in terms of like how organizations bring different funding sources together and that desire for like longer term and flexible funding, understandably, but also challenges for smaller organizations in terms of less capacity, fewer specialized roles. It tends to be common across the voluntary sector. But in terms of the specific features of the criminal justice voluntary sector in particular, they do tend to come from the fact that, as Khan mentioned, statutory funding and contract funding is so prominent in this space and how it does have associated challenges such as cost recovery of contracts, delays in receiving funding, difficulties funding systems change, as mentioned, little funding available for system change within this space. And lastly, the barriers, as I just talked through, for a better funding landscape, changes in focus and personnel at the governmental level, differences between prisons, specifically key individuals in prisons, and time and resource constraints on behalf of funders to collaborate and enact kind of like widespread changes to funder practice. So as mentioned, this is definitely the headline findings from our research, and we've shared the report in the chat. We will share it again. So please do, of course, read that for more detail. But we're going to stop talking at you, and we're going to go into our first breakout discussion, which is all around reactions to our findings. So three key prompts there. Which findings stood out for you and why? Which findings were more surprising, and what did you expect to see more of in our findings? So we're going to go away for about 10 minutes and then come back and regroup.
Hey, do you need any help getting into your breakout? Just let me know if you do.
Welcome back, everyone. Sorry if any conversations were cut off abruptly, as often happens with breakout discussions. Just wait for Khan to come back and he'll bring up the slides again.
And
Be happy to.
can you see the slides?
Yes, please. We can't see them yet.
Can see them. Interesting. There you go. Sorry.
Perfect. No, thank you all. Really interesting conversations in the rooms that I was in. I think just for time, with me rambling on, we might share back key insights once after the second breakout room rather than go around the facilitators just now. But I will go through the recommendations that we basically arrived at from this research. If we go to the next slide. Definitely, it was very much a consultative process and writing these recommendations in reaction to the initial findings. So obviously the different organisations, as Sam mentioned, Clinks, HMPPS, AB Charitable Trust feeding in, previous interviewees fed in as well, and the Clinks event that we presented out, we got some really good feedback there too. So thank you to everyone who's been on the call who did feed into this. But with a bit of back and forth, we kind of drill down on these following categories for different recommendations. First, around and the main categories: funder priorities, both philanthropic funders, statutory funders, or both. Recommendations directed at both, and then application and reporting processes as well. So, in terms of the recommendations for philanthropic funders in particular, a consistent ask for voluntary organisations for funds to provide more opportunities for flexible multi-year funding, reduce application burdens, cover non-delivery costs, and also to support organisational learning as funders deliver, as mentioned. Understandably, this is really support organisations in lots of different ways, and a consistent ask across the voluntary sector. Then, as mentioned, needs analysis was not a part of this research, but given the very small proportion that goes to systems change or like more upstream initiatives, we felt that philanthropic funders in particular had a role to kind of step in and potentially provide more funding for systems change initiatives due to that perceived hesitancy from statutory funders and there's a small proportion of funding currently allocated. Then for statutory funders, and this is something that came up in the discussions just now as well, more clarity from statutory funders over which activities and initiatives fall under the remit of statutory responsibilities, which can be a first step for both statutory and philanthropic funders in planning how to practically address ongoing funding gaps. Confusion from both philanthropic funders and voluntary organisations as to what specifically comes under the remit. So clarifying as far as statutory funders possibly can would really be beneficial to identify those funding gaps and support funders and working together. The next one around like minimum standards of contracting, including covering the full costs of delivery. So organisations are not out of pocket for delivering statutory funding, statutory contracts, which has been a persistent challenge in this space. And then lastly, as mentioned before, given the multifaceted support that organisations provide, and different needs for individuals interacting with the criminal justice system, funders should seek to collaborate across relevant government departments without cutting back that tailored support. One caveat that we heard as we were coming to these recommendations was that by funders collaborating, we didn't want it to be like to kind of result in less funding going out specifically to support individuals. You wouldn't want collaboration to come at the cost of more additional funding. So being able to collaborate across relevant government departments more where it would be more relevant for statutory funders to collaborate without cutting back maybe tailored support that different departments it's more suitable for different departments to focus on. So some of the recommendations for statutory funders in particular, and for funders in general, so both philanthropic and statutory funders, there's a bit of an appetite for pooled funding for specific initiatives. Understandably, voluntary organisations thought if done well, it would cut back the amount of application reporting processes. But this would only be the case if you did have a large amount of funding, like the pooling did result in a larger pot of funding like per grant. Also striking a balance between like shared goals and flexibility. So not kind of like with funders coming together going to the lowest common denominator or ignoring that kind of like tailored support, but being able to be more flexible for organizations to like meet the needs of individuals. And as mentioned, not by collaborating or coming together, inadvertently restricting the amount contributed to the funding landscape. But yeah, just to say that done well, there is a real appetite for like pooled funding in the criminal justice landscape for like specific initiatives. As mentioned, and an agreed approach to funding innovation, some real frustrations for organisations about the amounts, or the the seemingly high amount of focus on funding innovation compared to tried and tested approaches. What like an agreed approach from the foundation about how much should go towards innovation, and also like next steps for innovation as well. We heard from organisations who funded something that was seen to be innovative, and by the time that they'd kind of proved this concept, the funding there wasn't that continuation funding, and so making sure that if there was a more aligned approach, can help to kind of answer some of those frustrations in current approaches to funding innovative approaches. And lastly, as mentioned earlier, um, co-created guidance for trusts and foundations less familiar with the criminal justice system. Like a dummies guide was suggested by one funder interviewee about like the key terms, institutions, and also like experience of like previous funding efforts within this space. The kinds of things that are more or less likely to be successful or in this and reasonable and proportionate in terms of what funders expect of voluntary sector organisations. Then in terms of recommendations for application and reporting processes, we did just want to say that there are currently within the voluntary sector and in the funding landscape, there's lots of collaboration going or trends that kind of touch on a lot of these recommendations that we wanted to acknowledge, and they're detailed in the full version of this report, especially about how application processes can reduce the burden on those who are applying. So agreeing more on like shared and proportionate due diligence standard for applicants, especially with consideration for specific sensitivities in the criminal justice landscape. So sharing information on previous convictions, for example, on staff or organisations that are looking to embed more lived experience in terms of their delivery, how they run their organisations. So having proportionate and sensitive due diligence standards for organisations in this space. Adequately funding and supporting equity in funding processes, as mentioned, a real, some positivity from voluntary organisations about recent trends or a recent perceived increased focus from funders and funder practice, which is really positive. But making sure that this is adequately funded to support like genuine like collaboration and co-delivery in ways that are not kind of tokenistic or tick boxy through more restricted funding. And lastly, considering aligning on an approach to funding non-delivery costs, or if we go back one slide, Khan, creating an approach to funding non-delivery costs, so funding in more flexible ways, as mentioned, always a preference for voluntary sector organisations. Then lastly, a more general one, reporting processes. We did discuss like shared, like aligning more on reporting processes, felt to be quite difficult and impractical to strictly align or say this is how you measure this kind of thing, because you want to make sure that they are tailored and proportionate to the specifics of the organisations and activities. But just making sure that if there is more alignment within funders, say for a pooled initiative, making sure that they are suitable to the size of grants and specifics of activities, which would likely reduce time spent for organisations. But as mentioned, lots of promising trends in the sector with some of these changes to application and reporting processes that are detailed for pool. Great. If we just move on then, Khan. Our full recommendation, if you scroll to page 50 in the report, I'll just reshare the links now again in the chat. You can have the full recommendations for this breakout room. I've also shared a link to our 2021 research that was looking at funding gaps in the sector of interest as well. But if we go into our final breakout room for 10 minutes, if we go over to the next slide. Reflections on our recommendations, specifically which 1 to 2 recommendations do you think are the really key ones for funders to focus on going forward, and why? Which 1 or 2 recommendations do you think are less of a priority, and why? And any other recommendations that you would have liked to have seen in the report. I said any other, really thinking about those key 1 to 2, like if organisations were to really focus on those. We'll go for 10 minutes and then come back at around 25 past. Great. Welcome back, everyone. Just 4 minutes left of the meeting. I think we have time very briefly to quickly hear from the facilitators about what came up in the different rooms. So, Khan, in a sentence, what were the key things that kind of came up in the breakout rooms?
Um, so the first one, the first breakout room, no major surprises in terms of findings, and I think it's a good validation of the report in terms of what we represented, what people experience on the field. And the second one, really interesting conversations. Obviously, there's a reference to AI and how it can be used in certain conditions. And yeah, that was my highlight from the second one.
Great. Thanks, Khan. Joseph?
I think, yeah, again, no huge surprises. What was interesting was talking about, obviously, we know the funding, the non-statutory funding is lower. There was a discussion about why that is. Is that because the public doesn't want to give as much? And therefore, can we address that by trying to educate the community about the need for rehabilitation, the need for some of these services? I think in terms of recommendations that are important to get forward, it was a really, really clear answer that systems change is what people were excited about as having more potential, and systems change is what we need. And we were talking about the importance of trying to collaborate on that and maybe have these, pooled funding pots that we can actually do a bit more with based on a systems change approach. So that came through really clearly.
Great. And Sarah?
Yeah, just to mention one thing that I found really interesting, which was some charities were saying that they're kind of being squeezed at both ends. So they might not be large enough to take on a statutory contract, but they might be actually too large to get some funding from trusts and foundations.
Yes, they'd actually come up with the 500k threshold in particular for organisations that were like 500 weights over. That's a bit more difficult than when they were 499. And what we heard in my breakout rooms, like finding with people's experience in the space, definitely more of a desire for collaboration between shared recommendations and bit of a desire for like this dummy guide in particular. But thank you so much, everyone. There's never enough time for these breakout discussions, especially rambling on. But I really do appreciate those conversations there. And just I'll quickly hand back to Suzanne for closing remarks from Lloyds.
Thank you. And I just first wanted to say a massive, massive thank you to you, John and Khan at NPC in particular, for conducting the research and bringing us together today. And yeah, this is not the end. This research is very much intended to be a first step. So we need to keep the conversation going. Exact directions for that, still unknown. But a key finding and cause for thought for me, for example, is how statutory funding just isn't reaching the small and more specialist organisations in the CGS, or fewer of them. So digging deeper into what they need and what can be done from funders on both sides would be a really worthwhile next step. And I know Clinks and HMPPS are excited about looking tangibly at those recommendations and which ones we can feasibly action going forward. So yeah, it doesn't end there. So please do get in touch with me with any queries, comments, ideas. My email address is on the screen. And yeah, particularly keen to have any conversation with funders that are thinking about next steps.
Great. Thanks, Suzanne.
Drop the email into the chat, because that will be much easier for us to pick it up. We can't pick it up off the screen.
Oh, yes, and we will. As I say, there will be a wrap-up email with all the helpful links, and we can share your email address there, Suzanne. Again, just a huge thank you for coming today. Thank you to everyone. Lots of you on the call have been involved in this research, so I really do. Again, thank you so much for your efforts over the past month in particular. Next steps after this, please do complete the feedback survey. Obviously, we love data at NPC, so really would value your insight there. Please do read and share the full report and check out our resources and events on the website. All helpful links will be shared in the wrap-up email. And thank you once again for attending.
Wonderful.